Hi, I'm Femi OK. You're in the stream. We are live on Al Jazeera and YouTube. Today, it's been 6 months since the Grenfell fire tragedy in London. Are survivors getting what they need?
And I'm Malika Bilal. I'll be bringing our guests your comments. Also on today's show, a new report by the Committee to Protect Journalists says that 2017 saw a record number of journalists jailed. We'll be asking why.
But first, a stunning defeat for the Republican Party right here in the US, and some say for President Donald Trump as well. Have a look at this clip from the Al Jazeera online team.
And we're looking at that. May God bless you as you go on.
Joining us now from New York, our sometime co-host of ours at the stream, Ahmed Shihab Eldin, is an AJ Plus correspondent as well. He's returned from Alabama just on Wednesday night. Ahmed, for people who are following this story, trying to keep up with it from overseas, in a nutshell, what's it about? What does it mean?
Well, this is really a historical moment in the United States, especially after everything that's happened with President Trump in the last year. I mean, for the first time in 25 years, a Democrat got elected to the U.S. Senate in Alabama. And to give you some context, you know, Birmingham, Alabama is America's fourth blackest city, but it is a very segregated and perhaps as segregated as states get today. It's where Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus. Of course, Martin Luther King Jr. wrote his letter from Birmingham jail. And where, you know, these 4 little girls in 1963, a very historic moment in Birmingham, were killed in the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. So, you know, this election very much today was not only about a referendum on President Trump, but about Alabama's kind of bloody civil rights history. And that factors into how many African Americans voted. So, you know, a lot of the media's attention here in America, for those who might not have been as, you know, caught up on the nitty-gritty of this election, has been on the sexual assault allegations and child molestation allegations against Roy Moore. People saying that's what helped push Jones over the edge. But to me, it's important to pay attention to the fact that the black vote in Alabama was a bigger percentage of the votes than they are the population.
You know, Yasmin, it's funny you say that. We got this tweet from Laura. She says, this wouldn't have happened without the hard work of black folks and young people. And of course, we also saw a lot of tweets online with people congratulating and thanking, really, black women for voting, which of course sparked a lot of conversations because they also really helped push that win for the Democrats. You spoke to black voters. What is it they told you ahead of the vote?
Well, you know, there have been a lot of things in the mainstream media recently that have appeared. You know, in 2011, Roy Moore, who's a maniacal candidate that many people should have felt or said to me that they felt should have been disqualified from even being considered. He appeared on this radio show where he talked about getting rid of constitutional amendments after the 10th Amendment here in the U.S. He said that would, quote, eliminate many problems in how our government is structured. So imagine being a black voter, you know, and hearing that there's a man who may very well represent you in Washington as your senator, and he's, you know, flirted with the idea of getting rid of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. And, you know, he said many incredibly controversial things about, you know, America, like, you know, President Trump. His campaign was about making America great again. You know, he said that even during slavery, America was great because families were united. So, you know, we spoke to, for example, the 5th little girl who was, you know, in that bombing but survived. She lost her eye, and she put it as simply as this. You know, Roy Moore wants to go backwards. He wants to take us back to this so-called time when America was great. We want to move forward, and kind of the despair and shock and the disbelief that this was actually even happening, that this could be their senator was enough to get them out into the polls.
You also spoke to some Roy Moore supporters. I'm just going to share some of those comments with our audience. Have a look.
This is Woodstock, a town in Bibb County just outside of Birmingham, Alabama, America's 4th blackest city. But this county is 76% white, and in 2016, Trump won 77% of the vote here.
If they wanted to do something, they should have done it before when he was running for things. And why after 40 years do you come forward?
A lot of people say that women, sometimes when they do get, assaulted or what have you, that it takes them years to get the courage to come forward.
One of them had the interview on TV. There weren't no tears in her eyes. If it had, her mascara would have run.
If they're not true, why would all these women be saying this now? Who do you think would be behind it?
I think it's Doug Jones and the Democrats.
This is so revealing, Ahmed. What did it tell you about America that maybe you didn't know already? I mean, just following it from inside the States is fascinating. Watching it from outside the States, it's almost inexplicable.
Yeah, the cognitive dissonance was striking. It really alarmed me. We've been living all for, a very polarized and divided time in our country. And, this just confirmed all those things you hear about online and fake news and, perception versus reality. A lot of people in Alabama, I hate to say, are ignorant about very basic, facts when it comes to not just Roy Moore, but to the history of certain candidates, the Alabama state legislator, and specifically what you hear when you talk to these people who are, claiming to be, how can I put this? They claim that the reason that they support Roy Moore is because of his Christian values. A lot of them pointing to the fact that, he erected a statue of the 10 Commandments in City Hall, something that got him fired from his judgeship there in Alabama, because it was illegal. And so a lot of people kind of unable to articulate beyond the fact that he will make America great, justifying even some of his comments, saying that, family is what makes us great. And maybe there were, people saying straight to my face that maybe he's not wrong to say that about slavery. Really just goes to show how polarized the political landscape is. But on the flip side, that this happened in the heart of Dixie in Alabama in the South is not just a referendum on Trump. I mean, he had overall vote totals in Alabama that set all-time, high records. So for Doug Jones to have prevailed, it really speaks to not just how unelectable Roy Moore is, but this time in American history, when Trumpism is kind of being rejected and we have such a focus on these the exploitation and abuse of vulnerable people, in particularly women, and in Roy Moore's case, children, by powerful men who are, not really with the current times.
Unelectable, you said. And yet, we got this comment on Facebook because we asked whether or not this represents a political shift in Alabama. The first time that there's a Democrat in a lot of years. Billy here says, no, I truly don't believe this is a shift at all. The Republicans put up a truly repugnant candidate whose own words and actions did him in. That said, and of course, this is a view of Billy on Facebook, he still got, and we're talking Roy Moore here, almost half the vote. There still were a lot of people, included in that package, and people that you talked to who were willing and ready to vote for him.
No, and that's an extremely important point. I mean, the context around this election is very critical. It's true that this is the first time a Democrat gets elected in 25 years, but it is also true that there were enough people who believed the fake news stories, who believed that this was all a Democratic ploy. And the real troubling thing is, this is a time when you have people like President Trump who can make it into office. You have people like Roy Moore who could get close to making it into office. So in many ways, even though Billy brings up a good point, it's important to remember that Trump, despite all the allegations against him, just a year ago got elected. And even though this is not, a presidential election, it's interesting to note that Trump, very similar to Roy Moore, both in terms of his political, kind of fringe, blow up the system approach to politics, was elected and Roy Moore wasn't. So at the very least, if President Trump invested heavily in Roy Moore, he recorded robocalls. There was a lot of big donors coming from Washington in the last week of the election. He traveled down south. Steve Bannon was there. So in many ways, this is very much a rejection of Trumpisms or Trumpist politics, if you will.
Right.
And I think that's something we can't ignore.
Ahmed, thank you so much. We're going to leave it there, and we go from the US state of Alabama to the capital of the UK. 6 months after a fire destroyed a public housing tower block in London, and campaigners say their work is not yet done. We covered this story extensively after it happened, and at that time, one of the main concerns was how to house survivors. DJ Isla was a guest on the stream.
Somebody said to me, they said, oh, I've got 21 studio flats. So I went and I spoke to somebody she's just a normal person. And I said, you know, we've got 21 studio flats. You know, we can put some of the families in there. And apparently they were said if they were to go into the places that we've offered them, then they are making themselves, they're not homeless anymore, so they're not a priority. So what? So they're a priority if they're at Westway in a shelter. But if I can find them somewhere where they can go and be a little bit more comfortable, they don't become priority.
As you heard there, campaigners were worried that the housing needs of survivors were not being met quickly enough. At the time, British Prime Minister Theresa May promised that those who lost their homes would be rehoused within 3 weeks. But according to the British Health Service and campaigners, only 45 of 210 households made homeless have been permanently resettled. Joining us now from London, Richard Bergen is Justice spokesman for the Labour Party. And fresh from the silent march commemorating the 6-month anniversary of the Grenfell fire, Melvin Akins is a community activist. Welcome to the stream, both of you. I want to start with pictures from that vigil, the silent march. This is Ken Loach. Hundreds of people have arrived for the silent walk. You can see them there holding their signs. One says grace, the other says justice for Grenfell. Here's another tweet. Fiona says, "Tonight I'm at the Grenfell Tower silent walk, which marks 6 months since the fire. It's very emotional here. Hundreds of people have gathered outside Notting Hill Methodist Church, where the peaceful march will begin." Melvin, you're just back from that march. Thank you for taking the time to join us here today. Describe for our audience what the atmosphere was like.
It's a very somber atmosphere, a time to reflect. The whole day has been pretty much about remembering the lives of the people who lived in that tower, 71 people officially. We had a memorial service at our cathedral, our central London cathedral, St Paul's, which set the tone for the day, where we had 1,500 guests together with members of the royal family to pay their respects to those people who lost their lives. And now we are continuing it again this evening, as we have done for the 14th of every single month since the fire, to commemorate the dead.
Melvin, when we last talked about Grenfell, we were still talking about how many more families still have to be housed. If you could sum that up, where are we right now?
Still very much behind schedule, ultimately. The government said initially that they would house everybody within 3 weeks. They've obviously massively overshot that, and they have subsequently said that they aim to have rehoused all of the survivors by Christmas. That leaves them with 2 weeks to house near on over 100 people, and I do believe that they are not going to meet that second target either.
Richard, if I can just bring you in here, there's an inquiry that started this week, and you also got together with some of the survivors and asked them for their stories. What are the stories that really stood out in your mind? Because each time we go back and revisit the Grenfell tragedy, it just reminds us how horrific a tragedy it actually was. What stood out for you?
Well, what stood out for me were the stories of people escaping down the stairwell of the block, and sadly having to pass by people who had passed away on the stairs. It was very shocking. People talking about the fear of being in the block, but also people talking about the experiences after the fire. People shunted into hotel rooms rather than actual houses, and being pulled up on the procedure of the hotel, such as you can't have your wife, if she's due to give birth, staying in our hotel because that's against hotel policy. So at the same time that people were worrying about their loved ones who are still in hospital from smoke inhalation, for example, they were having to contend with the bureaucracy of being in hotels and not being in proper accommodation. So people have been let down before this horrific fire and afterwards as well, because action should have been taken to fulfil the promise, getting everybody into suitable and proper accommodation. It's not too much to ask. The people and families deserve far better than this.
I want to play a video comment we got from a campaigner who is also a previous stream guest, and this is what he told us about marking this anniversary.
6 months on from the Grenfell Tower tragedy, we were united today with people of all faiths, cultures, backgrounds at the St. Paul's National Memorial Service. It was a poignant reminder that we have more in common with each other, and it was also a chance for us to reflect and stand in solidarity, shoulder to shoulder, with all the survivors and the bereaved families. But it also was a very, very important lesson, a reminder for us to think ahead, to work together and to mobilize as one community as we responded in the aftermath of the fire to continue our work to reach justice and accountability.
So he mentions reaching justice there. This is what Trevor Allman on Twitter says. A total change of culture is needed towards people in public housing, his view of justice. He says, I know from my time as a counselor, tenants are far too often seen as a nuisance and treated with contempt, as are their concerns about the buildings they live in. Melvin, what's changed since the last time you were on this show, justice-wise?
Well, very little. Ultimately, the public inquiry only really kicked off 2 days ago. So we are very much into our infancy in terms of investigations and the disclosure as to what actually happened. The police, the Metropolitan Police Service in this country, have said that they may not even get to questioning certain companies and individuals up to as late as 2019. So the process is going to be very slow and painstaking in the process, and obviously that's going to be very frustrating for people who are immediately affected and members of the community who want answers.
Richard, you've written a piece just in the last few hours for The Independent, what I learned from the Grenfell families about the inquiry this week. I just want to show our audience who's in charge of this inquiry, Sir Martin Moore-Bick. You have some concerns about how the inquiry is going to be run. And it's only the first week. What's your biggest concern about this inquiry?
The point I'd make to start off with is that quite rightly, survivors and bereaved families feel let down by the establishment totally. So this, given what's happened to them in the fire and given what happened to them afterwards. And so what's key is that their trust is earned through this process. The inquiry has to earn the trust of the community. It can't assume it. And what we need is an inquiry which will get truth and justice, because that's what people deserve at the very least. And so what we need, in my view, is a panel with diverse life experience in order to make sure that inquiry earns that trust and delivers truth and justice. Now, the Prime Minister Theresa May has the power in law to secure and deliver that in consultation with the judge. So far she's chosen not to do that, and the families actually delivered to Downing Street earlier this week a petition asking for an inquiry panel to be set up. There's similar inquiry panels that we've seen in the past, and really now the Prime Minister, as a nominated minister in legislation under the Inquiries Act, needs to take this action in order to ensure we've got that inquiry panel, because people at the very least deserve truth and justice.
So who, in your opinion, should be on that panel?
Well, the community there is a very diverse community, and I think that the panel needs to be diverse as well, diverse in its life experience. A point was actually made by one of the lawyers for the family very effectively the other day in the inquiry proceedings on this very point. So I think it's something the Prime Minister now needs to take action to deliver, because she, in consultation with the judge, can appoint a balanced and diverse inquiry panel to assist the judge in ensuring that this inquiry delivers the answers. We need to get to the bottom of what happened. We need to get to the bottom of why working class people are being treated in this way. What we can't have is people who've survived Grenfell and bereaved families having to fight for year after year to get to the truth in the way people, for example, did after the Hillsborough disaster.
I want to end with this comment we got via YouTube because the world is watching. Nick says Perth in Australia woke up about safety standards because of that this tragedy. It woke us up, and it's sad that it had to happen that way. Thank you to Richard Bergen and Melvin Akins for your time, for joining us today. We hope to have you back as the story develops. Now, a shocking report from the Committee to Protect Journalists says that a record number of journalists were imprisoned for their work in 2017. This CPJ video highlights the case of just one.
One of our colleagues, Mahmoud Hussein, is also in prison in Egypt, and he's been there for 359 days. Rights groups and Al Jazeera are demanding his release. With us to discuss this, we have Courtney Raj. She's Advocacy Director at the Committee to Protect Journalists. Courtney, this is not a great job that you have, unfortunately, talking to people about how many journalists are in prison. This year, were you surprised about the number and countries?
Sadly, no, we were not surprised. We've seen Turkey being the leading jailer of journalists last year, and then several years ago, we know that there was this post-coup attempt crackdown that has resulted in massive arrests of journalists and closures of media outlets. Sadly, under President Sisi, Egypt has become one of the world's leading jailer of journalists as well. When I lived in Egypt and worked there were no journalists in jail, and now it's consistently at the top. And unfortunately, China is also perennially at the top of the list. So we see that these three countries have been at the top of the list. They continue to jail journalists. We no longer have an international community who is routinely condemning this. So sadly, no, I'm not surprised.
There's a comment here that most journalists won't like, but it's via Facebook, and I want to bring it up because there are people that think like this. Anthony's not the only one. Anthony says, good for them, because most journalists nowadays are fake news providers. So there is that view there. Here's what U.S. Senator John McCain has to say about that. Press Freedom's annual report, he tweeted, shows record number of journalists imprisoned worldwide in 2017, including 21 on fake news charges. POTUS, the United States president, must understand his harmful rhetoric only empowers repressive regimes to jail reporters and silence the truth. Courtney, talk to us about what quote-unquote fake news has done for press freedom.
So fake news is a catch-all term. Obviously, there are things such as disinformation campaigns, but what we see is that fake news is a term that's used to delegitimize journalism, to try to undermine journalism, and to try to essentially undermine a key pillar of democracy. So it's very concerning when you see China and official Chinese agencies coming out and welcoming President Trump's use of the word fake news. It's very disturbing when you have Cambodia using the fake news excuse to kick out independent media from their country. It's disturbing when you see Russia and Egypt using that as an excuse to imprison journalists, and not only that, to then deny them medical care. It's completely false and illegitimate to think that journalists deserve to be in prison for their work. They are the ones who are bringing us the information that we know. They're risking their lives on the front lines in Syria, in the DRC, in Mexico to bring us news. So it's sad to hear that perspective, that anyone thinks a journalist should be jailed for doing their job.
Our viewers following this programme can go to cpj.org and you can see the journalists imprisoned in 2017, where the red areas are. You can click on it and you can see the numbers of journalists. Turkey has 73, China 41, heading up to Russia 5, and so on and so on. Courtney, if people are watching this, they're following this, they're seeing this report, what do they do about it?
They've got to demand that their leaders stop using this terminology of fake news. They need to realize that most of what they know as citizens come from the media, and demand that journalists be given the respect that they need. Pay for news. That will help. Pay for journalists and for the defense that they need. Make sure that when the president of the United States decides to give his presidential visits to the leading jailer of journalists,
Sure.
that is seen as unacceptable, or at least that the issue of jailing of journalists is on the agenda. And please join us at Press Freedom on Twitter and join our campaigns, including the one for Shao Kahn, who you saw, who is in dire condition and needs medical attention that he is being denied, and your colleague, who has also been denied medical attention.
Courtney Raj, thank you so much for being with us today. We're always following the work of the CBJ. If you've got a story that you would like us to do here on the stream, send us a tweet, #AJStream. See you online.